Walter Block. I'm one of the speakers later on today, but it's my honor and privilege now to introduce my friend Michael Edelstein, who will be our next speaker. I first met Michael in the 70s. We were both patients of Albert Ellis, and we used to play chess all the time. Then we decided we were both pretty lousy at chess and we weren't getting anything out of it, so we sort of talked to each other a bit more. One of the highlights of my experiences with Michael is my mentor is Murray Rothbard, and his is Albert Ellis. And one time the four of us got together and we sung rational songs. It was a real treat. We have this sort of reciprocal relationship where I tutor him in libertarianism and he tutors me in REBT, rational emotive therapy. And I think he's a better student of mine than I was of his. One of the articles that I wrote, one of my best articles with him as a co-author, is how would we get to own through homesteading land that we want to stay pristine, given that the libertarian theory of homesteading means you have to do something with the land. So if you're interested, email me and I'll send you that article. Michael is the author of 4 books on therapy, psychotherapy. I think his most famous one is 3-Minute Therapy. You buy this book, he's got a few available, $20, and you will be cured in 3 minutes. Michael.
Thank you, Walter, for that wonderful introduction. It'll probably be the highlight of my talk. The other highlight of my talks usually are the question and answer period. So I'll try to follow Rosalind's excellent lead and leave a lot of time for questions and answers. Since we're talking about self-esteem, I'd like to start with defining it. To esteem something means to think highly of it. So self-esteem means to think highly of oneself. And this thinking highly of oneself, thinking you're a good person, a worthwhile person, a success, that kind of thinking leads to emotions. Feeling good about yourself, or feeling like you're a worthwhile person. So what's happening here is we normally evaluate our behaviors. I did well at the race, which makes sense to evaluate your behaviors, and then overgeneralize from the rating of your behavior. I did well in the race, therefore I'm a good person. And then that leads to high self-esteem. So the entire message of my talk can be put in just a few words, that self-esteem comes from self-rating, not rating your performance only or your behaviors, but rating your entire self based on your performance. And I plan to show a number of ways that doesn't make sense. What I'll try to do is puncture the self-esteem of self-esteem. So the question is, since we're dealing with emotions, feeling worthwhile about yourself, or low self-esteem would be feeling worthless about yourself, the question is, where do our emotions come from? And the Stoic philosopher Epictetus had an opinion on that. He said, it's not events themselves that create our emotions, but rather it's our thinking about these events. Or alternatively, Hamlet said, nothing is good or bad, but thinking makes it so. Another way of expressing this is the famous ABC model devised by Albert Ellis. So A is an activating event. For example, I do poorly at work and I get fired. And then C, we'll skip B for a moment, C is my emotional consequences. I feel bad about myself, I feel worthless, I feel like a failure. But the point is, A never causes C. It's never an event itself, no matter how good or how bad being fired, being hired, getting approval, getting rejected. It's never those events that cause our high or low self-esteem, but it's B, our thinking about it. For example, in this case, I was fired, I did poorly at work, that's too bad, and I'm a bad person. So that's self-esteem. Let me give you a typical example from my clientele. I had a client named Jerry, and he was about 26, and he was a very successful real estate developer, and he drove a Porsche, and he loved to water ski, and he did very well at it. He was engaged to an intelligent, successful lawyer, and he felt good about himself. But then when the real estate market crashed, he got very depressed. The explanation was when he was doing well, he evaluated himself, his worth, his personhood, his being in terms of his behavior, doing well, and felt good about himself. And then when he started to do poorly, he felt bad about himself and had thoughts of suicide. So that's where self-esteem comes from. Now, there are other ways people get self-esteem, which I think is equally illegitimate. For example, there was a study done with 13-year-olds from 6 different countries: United States, Britain, Spain, Ireland, Canada, Korea, and they were given a math test, and then they were given a questionnaire, and the question was, I am good at math. The students from the United States scored highest on the question, I am good at math, and last on the math test. And the explanation for that is that in the government schools, they have a self-esteem curriculum where you're taught you're a good person, everyone loves you, and but that detracts from really studying hard and working hard at things. So they had this unrealistic estimation of themselves. Now, there are many problems of self-esteem. I think it's unempirical, it's illogical, it's unpragmatic, it doesn't work, it's confused, there's no point to it. Other than that, I love it. Now to look at some of the empirics, take someone who's a great surgeon and saves people's lives every day, yet he has a few problems. He has a drinking problem, he's abusive to his wife and children, he kicks the dog. So he has some good behaviors, he has some bad behaviors. How can he possibly rate his total self with this mix? And we're all a mix of good and bad behaviors. There's no calculus that allows us to do it, and it's not observable. We can observe his behaviors, we can observe him saving lives, we can observe him drinking too much, but we can't observe him that he's a good person or a bad person. People don't walk around with halos or horns or anything like that. Humans are in constant flux. We're all a process, we're all changing. But to give someone a total rating or give yourself a total rating as good or bad confuses the process with a product. It's sort of like a painting where the colors are constantly changing and you see some red on the painting and you see that's a red painting. But shortly there's no red, or there's more red, or there's green, or there's blue. And that's the way humans are. We're a process. We could do poorly today, do well tomorrow. So again, there's no way of taking a product, we're not a product, we're a process, and saying that's us, that's the evaluation of us. If you have a student who's good at some subjects, math and music, and poor at English and grammar, and has friends, treats their friends nicely, but treats their parents nastily, again, Does it make sense for this child to think well of themselves or poorly of themselves? I don't think so. Also, it tends to lead people to observe their behavior and measure themselves in terms of their behavior. So they're focusing on doing well, not for the intrinsic pleasure of it, but rather because it leads to proving themselves and feeling better about themselves. So there's really no point to that. It's illogical because it takes your traits and says that it follows that the evaluation of your traits is evaluation of yourself. In the 60s, there was an acerbic talk show host on TV. His name was Joe Pine, and he was very controversial and a conservative. And one of his guests was Frank Zappa. Frank Zappa was an early rock and roll musician with long hair when it wasn't fashionable yet. And Joe Pine had been in World War II, and he lost a leg in World War II, and he had a wooden leg. So as soon as Frank Zappa walked on stage, Joe Pine said, "You have long hair. I guess you're a girl." And Frank Zappa shot back, "You have a wooden leg. I guess you're a table." And that's really the structure of self-esteem. You take behaviors and you say, this is the entire person. Now, and having high self-esteem really doesn't work, and there's no point to it. As I said, you focus on trying to prove yourself, prove that you're a good person, rather than enjoying yourself. And it encourages giving up because you're more likely to have a fear of failing. Because if you fail, your ego's on the line, and then your self-esteem goes down. It leads to obsessing, dwelling, ruminating, anxiety, and depression. And I'd say about 70 to 80% of my clients have problems because they believe in self-esteem, because of their low self-esteem. And even though many of them are accomplished and do well in life, they focus on the problems, their imperfections, and because that's what humans have a tendency to do, we all have a tendency to focus on the negative. It's an evolutionary, psychological tendency we have, and so that tends to create these problems. It also discourages thinking out of the box, because if you take a risk, stick your neck out, and come up with new ideas or novelties, there's more of a chance that there's a problem with them, and then you go back to being a failure or being a worthless person in your own mind if you entertain this self-esteem concept. And for similar reasons, it encourages conformity and nationalism, because when you identify yourself with things out there, then you're more likely to identify with the state. I am the state, and the state is me, and the further the state goes out and its imperialism and nationalism, the better person you are. So we always have to do better compared to other countries to prove that we're good people. Now, let's apply this to Ayn Rand herself. Ayn Rand had some very, very good, noble traits. She had a vision for a better world. She was undeterred by criticism and derision. She had a lot of courage. She influenced millions with her books. Atlas Shrugged still sells over 500,000 books a year, which is marvelous. Yet she had some very negative traits. For about 40 years, she was addicted to dexedrine, caffeine, nicotine. She was hard to get along with and offensive to many people. She started to develop a friendship with Frank Lloyd Wright, and he rejected her because she was so obnoxious. And when she had lung surgery for lung cancer from smoking, she insisted that her inner circle not tell anyone that she had cancer. And then after her surgery, she continued to smoke and died about 8 years later. So by her own standards, she had much self-destructive behavior, irrational behavior, immoral behavior, yet she did many great things. So if we use self-esteem and apply it to Ayn Rand, would it make sense for her to give her high self-esteem based on the great things she did, or low self-esteem based on all her problems, irrationality, and imperfections? That's really an unanswerable question, because self-esteem cannot be arrived at in any kind of calculus. Now, the main exponent of Ayn Rand's idea of self-esteem was Nathaniel Brandon. He wrote 7 books on self-esteem. Ayn Rand didn't write any books on self-esteem. She mentioned it from time to time in her novels and her books, but no major works. And in Nathaniel Brandon's books on self-esteem, he has various definitions of self-esteem, but one of the clearest is in his book, The 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem. And he highlights 6 pillars of self-esteem. The first is the practice of living consciously, by which he meant being aware and being mindful. So it's the practice of living consciously. It's a behavior, it's an action. Number 2 was the practice of self-acceptance, accepting oneself. Again, that's a way of thinking, cognitive behavior, and as he says, a practice. Number 3 was the practice of self-responsibility, acting in a self-responsible way. 4, the practice of self-assertiveness, being assertive, expressing your own interests and values. 5, the practice of living purposefully, and by that he means formulating goals for your life and implementing the goals. And 6, the practice of personal integrity, by which he meant not being a hypocrite, standing by your convictions and your behaviors. So notice, and then you add this all up somehow, and he doesn't tell you exactly how to do that, and then you decide how well you do at these practices, and then give yourself a total rating based on the rating of your practices. So self-esteem, again, is self-rating rather than just trait or behavior rating. Now, all these practices are very respectable and excellent practices, and I don't have anything against that. It's just when you drag in self-esteem needlessly and ask yourself, am I a good person? Am I a bad person? Am I worthy of self-esteem or not? So again, it's an overgeneralization, and I don't see any point to it. So the solution to all this, if you're going to throw out self-esteem, the solution that I propose, which was proposed by Albert Ellis, who devised this theory of rational emotive behavior therapy, and by the way, had a debate with Nathaniel Brandon about this in 1969. The solution is unconditional self-acceptance. Accepting yourself as an imperfect human, whether you do well or poorly, or people will love you or hate you, all through that, your essence is just imperfectibility. You're just imperfect. You're not a good or bad person. And you can think of the free market as sort of a model for this. Normally, when you want to purchase something, you generally think about whether this is something you would like, and the opportunity costs, and whether it would benefit you. And normally you don't think about the worth of the person. Are they a good person or a bad person? That's really not part of it. You're focusing on situations. So focus on your behaviors, and if you do well, if you evaluate your behaviors as good, that helps, because then you can try to maintain those good behaviors. If you do poorly, well, that's good that you determine that, because then you could try to improve. But beyond that, saying, therefore, I'm a good or bad person seems to have no point. It doesn't help, and you'd be better off without it. Okay, well, thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
If I understood you correctly, you suggested that high self-esteem may be discouraging in that, like U.S. math students, who tend to do badly and feel great about it. But I've seen instances in which someone has done, a moderately good job at something, and they say, oh, third grader, that was terrific, that was really good, and that spurs them to actually pursue that.
Right.
How do you reconcile this?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question, and it highlights the confusion between self-esteem and self-confidence and task confidence. So if you say, that was great, you're commenting on the person's performance, their behavior, what they did, and I'm all in favor of that. That was great, you did great, but not self-esteem. You're a great person because you did great. Do you see the distinction there? Okay, good. Any other questions?
Yeah, referring to the case the gentleman was talking about American test takers having an elevated view. What's the difference between a false sense of one's worth and just plain vanity? It sounds like that. It sounds like vanity to me. This artificial high self-esteem.
Right. So the difference between a false sense of self-worth, and I think all senses of self-worth are false, and vanity. Vanity is one type of false sense of self-worth. Now, Nathaniel Brandon, in some of his books, said, well, there is a problem with self-esteem if you base your worth on the wrong thing. But if you base it on being responsible, being assertive, all these other things, then that's authentic self-esteem. So it makes sense to evaluate yourself, give yourself high self-esteem if you base it on these things, and that's authentic self-esteem. But as I'm trying to illustrate, all self-esteem just can be boiled down to one thing: rating your total self based on the rating of your behaviors, no matter what behaviors you choose. Now, some behaviors are better than others, so if you have to have high self-esteem, then it might be better to base it on being assertive, being responsible, being personable, things like that, than being a great crook. So that would be better, but there's a third alternative which avoids all these problems that I highlighted with self-esteem, and that's just rate your behavior and set goals, purposes, objectives in your life. Try to achieve those objectives, and if you're doing well at it, evaluate that. If you're doing poorly, evaluate that. But never along the way, or even at the end, if you achieve or don't achieve your goals, never say, therefore, I'm a good person or I'm a bad person, because, as I said, it's unempirical. There's no data to prove you're a good or bad person. There's just data to prove you did well or poorly. It's illogical. It doesn't follow from doing well somehow that magically turns you into a good person, and it doesn't work because it often leads to anxiety, depression, and those kinds of things.
Hi.
Hi.
So I kind of agree with you about the logic behind the self-esteem, but it doesn't seem like it's more of a factor of the nature. I mean, 5 books on self-esteem, is that what
7 books?
7.
Yeah, right.
Like, who even really thinks about it? We walk around, we're going, I'm feeling kind of nervous around these people. That seems to me like to be just the way your self-esteem might not be up par. That's maybe how I look at it anyways, and someone else is confident that they'll just go up and talk to 100 people and they're all relaxed, they feel good about themselves, etc. That seems like self-esteem, that's just the way we are. And if you say to someone, that doesn't make sense, they may even agree, but can they go, okay, it doesn't make sense I have a self-esteem, but wasn't I born with this inherent thing? How do you see that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it highlights the biological, genetic part of this. And as you said or implied, we are born with a genetic predisposition to rate our total selves based on the rating of our behaviors. So when I have a client who says, you know, one of these reasons I have these problems is because of the way I was raised. My parents told me I was a bad boy, and I'm working against that. I say it's even worse than that. You're not only working against that, your upbringing and reinforcement, but you're working against your genetic predispositions. So I agree that that's in there, but simply because we have genetic predispositions to act or think in certain ways doesn't mean we can't make major inroads in them. Does that answer your question, or just part of it? Okay.
You said the solution is an unconditional self-acceptance. How would you, or what ways would you recommend people practice or increase their unconditional self-acceptance?
That's a good question, which highlights how we change our beliefs and our thinking, because remember the ABC model, it's not the situation I did well or poorly that causes my high or low self-esteem at C, but it's B, our thinking about it. And so the issue is, how do you change your thinking to come to thinking or a conviction of unconditional self-acceptance? And the answer is the way we learn most things, and the basic learning principle is reinforcement is the royal road to learning. The more we practice, reinforce, go over a new way of thinking that makes sense, as long as it's meaningful and makes sense, the more we start to change our thinking and learn to get away from self-esteem and go more to self-acceptance. And one of the processes in doing that, again, is sort of a natural process. The way we reinforce it is through questioning, challenging, and contradicting our irrational thinking. So whenever you notice you're thinking, I'm a good person because someone loves me, or I'm a rotten person because I just screwed up, then you ask yourself, what is the evidence for it? There's evidence I screwed up, or there's evidence someone loves me, but what is the evidence that somehow magically turns me into a good or bad person? And if you think about it, normally you'll see there is no evidence. It's a fiction. Just like when you were 3 years old, you might have believed in Santa Claus, and then as you got older, you saw there's no evidence for Santa Claus. It was my parents that put those presents there. It doesn't make sense. So then you change your thinking, and it's the same process here. Question, challenge, and contradict the whole notion of self-esteem. Ask yourself, is there data for it? Does it follow logically? Because I did well, I'm a good person, or because I did poorly, I'm a bad person? And is it pragmatic? Does it work for me to have this rating of myself? Now the question comes up, well, if I don't feel good about myself, or if I'm not going for high self-esteem, what's the joy in life and what motivates me? And the answer is setting goals and working hard toward those goals as a motivator, because you would like to achieve your goals, obviously, otherwise they wouldn't be goals. So that's a motivator. That brings happiness and pleasure. The process, the byproduct of working hard towards something normally is happiness. And then if you're successful enough to achieve it, then that also leads to happiness. So we can have great happiness and great joy in life without self-esteem and without the attendant risks of anxiety, depression, obsessions, those kinds of things without self-esteem. Did that answer the question?
Michael, aren't you using the word, aren't you using two words here? One is self-esteem, which was the earlier part of your speech in which you mentioned about external validation. Nathaniel Brandon, when he uses the word self-esteem, he talks about internal validation. So aren't these two different kinds of self-esteems?
No, because I'm glad you raised that, because all motivation and all thoughts of self-esteem, anything like that, is based, really, the bottom line, it's based on internal values. So for example, let's suppose you tell me you like me, and I feel good about myself. Well, that starts out as external validation, but unless that's meaningful to me, you're liking me, then it's not going to really make an impact on me. So there is sort of, you could make an artificial division between external and internal in terms of where it starts out, but it always ends with internal validation because of my values. Does that answer your question?
No.
For many years, I know that Dr. Albert Ellis had a psychiatric session out in the open in an auditorium before hundreds of people. I was a little bit curious. My ex-wife was very curious. We went a couple of times. And what I got out of it was that they're perfectly normal-looking human beings that deep inside were pretty scary. They were suicidal, they were likely to kill someone right there in the audience or on the street. That couldn't be what Dr. Ellis was aiming for. What was he trying to bring out in these open psychiatric sessions, do you think?
Yeah, that brings me back to many years ago, because I used to go to those workshops and even volunteered a few times to talk about problems. And I think what he was trying to bring out was, A, demonstrating his approach to therapy, rational emotive behavior therapy, in front of the audience. Also, helping the person who came on stage with him with the problems that they brought up. And I think mainly to illustrate and demonstrate and to educate the audience about the basic principles of REBT, which is a great way to help others and help yourself with your emotional behavioral problems. So he actually demonstrated it. And he had the courage to demonstrate it, because a lot of therapists wouldn't want to be public about their work with clients, since often therapy is very ineffective. Does that answer the question?
Thank you, Dr. Edelstein. Actually, you and Nathaniel Brandon and others counsel people to help them understand themselves better. And I think for the most part, most of us are looking for feedback from friends and family. So as a person who people often come to for advice or feedback, what would you recommend to the average person in how to provide that feedback? When I say objective, I understand that we're not really objective, but in a way that helps them be more self-observant without criticizing their behaviors in front of judges.
Yes, good question. Yes, it makes a lot of sense. And one of the ways I recommend to my clients to do this is first ask for permission. Would you like some feedback? And if you wouldn't, I understand, that's okay, but I just wanted to be helpful. And then if they say yes, then the first step is to criticize yourself, because often when you criticize other people, they may feel you're implying you're good, you do it right, they don't know what they're doing, so I have to educate you. So start by criticizing yourself and say, I'm not the best in communicating, and I know I often could do better at communicating. And then compliment the other person. And I know you're interested in being a better communicator, and you do very well in some areas, but there's one thing I'd like to mention to you. And then deliver the criticism, whatever it is. So that's often a way that opens a person up to listening, rather than just barging right in and saying, you shouldn't talk so much. So this kind of introduction often is better than that.
Well, and then that latter part is a little bit like when they're the manager, too. You're really good at this. This is something I've noticed. And we've got, I know that you're anxious to improve yourself, so I congratulate you on that kind of thing. Yes, no?
Oh, absolutely, yes. In order to build a framework with another person, in order for them to accept criticism, complimenting the other people and giving them praise about their behaviors often leads to them being more open to you, liking you more, and being more willing to listen to what you have to say. By the way, you brought up the 1 Minute Manager. That was a book on the bestseller list for a number of years, I believe. What's that?
I think it still is.
Oh, is it? And it had one main message, and that is, instead of catching your employees doing something wrong, catch them doing something right, and then give them positive feedback on that. So I named my book The 3-Minute Therapy after that, and in the first chapter I have this one simple lesson, and then in the rest of the chapters I apply it to different problems such as anxiety, depression, procrastination, addictions, money worries, relationship problems, those kinds of things. And the one basic lesson, this was the subject for my talk here 2 years ago, was that all musts and shoulds, all demands, all absolutistic thinking leads to emotional problems. So to illustrate that with self-esteem, normally when you have low self-esteem, you start out with a demand on yourself. I must do well at this job, and if I don't, I'm no good. Now, if you give up your musts, underlying that is preferences, values, desires. I strongly prefer to do well at this job, and if I don't, I have disadvantages. It's not a reflection of my worth as a person. I have disadvantages in terms of achieving my goals, so then you can focus on your goals and doing better rather than saying, I'm no good as a person, getting depressed, and often doing worse. So if you give up the musts and shoulds, of which self-esteem is a derivative, I must do well, otherwise I'm a good person, or a bad person if I don't, then the global evaluation of yourself disappears. So that's the one lesson in the book, 3-Minute Therapy.
I think you talked about self-esteem in sort of the self-contained individual, and I'm wondering, when we put this individual together with others, is this the same person we call a narcissist?
I'm not very good at these labels. I don't find labels very useful, and there's a manual that many psychologists and psychiatrists use called the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It has all these diagnoses: narcissistic, borderline, antisocial. I don't really find that a useful way to diagnose people. I diagnose people in terms of their irrational beliefs, their musts and shoulds, and their global evaluations, and that tells me exactly how I can help them by helping them challenge and contradict their musts and shoulds. So I'm sorry, I'm a little weak on narcissism. Could you maybe elaborate using other words?
Yeah, I guess the fundamental belief in narcissism, as I understand it, is a feeling of being better than other people, and yet being extremely sensitive and vulnerable, and essentially, I think, having to hide that, or you put other people down to build yourself up because you're so sensitive. I think inherently, it's an inability to have mutually respectful relationships, and I'm seeing that would be an outcome of I mean, what you're describing about self-esteem strikes me as being exactly that, because if your self-esteem is always, your evaluation of yourself as a person is always based on how you're performing at any given moment, you have to outperform everybody else who's in the room.
Yes, that's a very good point, and one that I often mention in my talks. I neglected to mention it, so thanks for helping me with the talk. And that is, the idea of self-esteem leads to invidious comparisons with others. It's like you're on a seesaw. If I do well, I go up in my estimation as a worthwhile person, and if I do better than you, then you go down. So it is a matter of comparing oneself often in relation to others. Now, it's great to compare your traits in relation to others. So if Walter beats me in most games of chess, I could say he's better at chess than I am, and I'd like to beat him, so I'm going to study chess and work harder at chess. See, I'm focusing on my behaviors. But if I say Walter's a better person, then I get into this problematic area of self-esteem. And that's where narcissism comes in. I have to prove I'm a better person and be better than Walter and everyone else.
Michael, one of the problems of the libertarian movement is burnout. A lot of people start out as libertarian and notice that the state is still there and there's a lot of evil around the world, and then they just sort of get sick of it and leave, which is unfortunate because we need every libertarian. There are so few and each one is precious. How would you address that problem of libertarian burnout?
Yeah, I've given talks to libertarian audiences on overcoming feuding and burnout. And again, if you have an emotional problem or behavioral problem like burnout, and you see it as a problem. I'm not telling you if you're involved in some project and then you leave it, that's necessarily burnout. But if it is burnout, burnout normally means giving up unreasonably or compulsively. Again, the burnout comes from a must. I must change the libertarian movement so it gets the most popular political philosophy here, and if I don't, I'm no good. And then you have these unrealistic goals that you put a must to, so you try, and you don't seem to be getting anywhere. So then you conclude, I'm no good, and this is hopeless, and things like that. Whereas if you don't have a must, I prefer to make major changes, political changes in society. If I don't, that's too bad. Then it's still disappointing. You're not going to be happy about it. This isn't a feel-good approach, but it's less likely to lead to burnout and working at it. And Walter, I think you're a great model for this because you've been a libertarian since the 60s, I think, is that right? And the government is still growing, getting larger and larger, despite all your valiant efforts, and you seem to really enjoy working at it, and you're dismayed by this larger lack of success, but you still enjoy the work, you're still going at it, and I don't see you suffering from burnout anytime soon. Other questions?
Yeah, hi, Michael.
Yes, hi.
I wanted to ask a clarification for what you're advising of unconditional self-acceptance and what you were saying earlier about how nothing is good or bad, thinking makes it so. So I'm wondering, doesn't that toss out the concept of objective morality? And if so, how does REBT deal with an individual who does something that's awful, that most people would agree is awful, but thinks it's great and feels good about it?
Well, I don't try to help people get more popular. So if they're doing something that they think is okay, then the first question is, do they have any musts or shoulds that leads to this distorted view, or global evaluations that leads to this distorted view? And if they do, I help them with that, and that can often help them, if they're mistaken in their views, help them reevaluate that. So that's the basic thing. But if someone thinks the world is flat, it's not my job to disabuse them of that. But if they think it's awful, terrible, that they have to be miserable forever because the world is flat, then I help them with their emotional problems. I'm not sure if that addressed that, did it? Yeah. Okay, any other questions?
Throughout the course of your talk, I've become horrifyingly aware of my tendency to appeal to the self-esteem of others. They do something good, and I say, "Oh, you are great," and I'm just wondering what sort of are there any ramifications for that sort of other than self-esteem? Am I tricking myself into thinking these people are great when they're just good at these certain things, did a good job or something? Are there any ramifications of self-esteem?
Yeah, that's a great question and leads us to another area, and that is one of my specialties is working with couples, and sometimes it's not unusual when a couple comes in or one person in a couple comes in and they're having problems. What happened is when they fall in love, they idealize the person. And they think because this person is smart, accomplished, those kinds of things, they're a wonderful person. And then they start living with them and they see they have feet of clay. And because they didn't realize they were, no matter how wonderful this person is in certain areas, that person still is an imperfect human and is going to have his or her own problems, often severe problems. And they're taken by surprise, and then they go to the other extreme. This is an awful person. Or you see that in divorce fights, right? Someone that they loved for many years all of a sudden becomes the devil. And this is another ramification, as you're saying, of the self-esteem idea. But we're all, as Stefan Molyneux would say, we're all just people doing things, and then we put evaluations on what they're doing, what we're doing, which is fine, and then these global evaluations on ourselves and others, and then we have unrealistic ideas about ourselves and others. Other questions? Rosalind, did you have a question? You look questioning at times.
I was wondering I disagree with your interpretation of Nathaniel Brandon's definition of self-esteem.
Okay, and what did I miss?
But also, I wasn't, Nathaniel Brandon defines self-esteem as the combination of self-efficacy and your right to joy, a deep internal belief that joy is your birthright, and self-efficacy being defined as whether or not you're competent to handle life. And he didn't encourage thinking of self-esteem as your sum total and how to judge yourself. He talked about self-esteem as a set of behaviors and as a set of behaviors that he wanted to encourage. And one of the things he really encouraged was to accept yourself more. So I agree with everything you said. I translated it into different words about abstraction and presence, perception. But I disagree with your interpretation of it.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in that. Like, I'm wondering why, it's interesting.
So, as I defined self-esteem earlier, esteem means to feel good, and self-esteem means to feel good about yourself.
Right.
So, may I just finish? May I finish, please? And so, what he's saying, since his books are on self-esteem, he calls it self-esteem. What he seems to be saying is, do these things, these practices, self-efficacy, as you said, joy, all these things. These are your behaviors, cognitive, internal, external behaviors, and then he comes to self-esteem, feeling good about yourself. Now, that's as distinguished from Albert Bandura, who had this concept of self-efficacy, by which he meant you're efficacious in doing various things. You're good at this, you're bad at that, the other thing, but he didn't wrap it up into calling it self-esteem or a global evaluation. Sorry, go on.
No, I don't agree.
Okay.
Nathaniel Brandon said for him self-esteem was a mindset. It wasn't a judgment. It was a way of approaching the world.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, you're talking about judgments, the abstract judgments we make about ourselves, and our perceptual reality. If we focus on our feelings and needs, then we're not thinking about our abstract judgments of ourselves. If, instead of thinking, I am good, you think, wow, I really feel happy right now. So you focus on your feelings and needs rather than, you come into the present rather than abstract yourself. And Nathaniel Brandon was extremely for coming into the present and not abstracting yourself. And your definition of self-esteem is self-abstraction. It's a, I am good, that is a judgment, that's an abstract self. So it doesn't, but again, I agree with everything you said about self-esteem. I just don't think, I don't think you and Nathaniel Brandon, I disagree with how you interpret this word.
I understand. So that's a good explanation of Nathaniel Brandon's position. So if you're, say, in the moment and you don't abstract yourself, then you're happy now or you're doing well now. But then I'm not clear why he calls all this self-esteem, esteeming yourself. Why not just throw it out, as I'm saying, and enjoy the moment and be happy and be efficacious, those kinds of things, and forget about a report card on your total self, which he's calling self-esteem. Now, maybe, if what I understand you're saying, Rosalind, maybe the problem is he's just using self-esteem and he didn't mean self-esteem, but I'm taking him literally, so, yes?
He invented the word and the concept, and then or he defines it in a certain way, and then other people define it in other ways. But your argument, like you can't talk about his version of self-esteem unless you're going to talk about what he meant by self-esteem. What you talk about when you're talking about self-esteem is not what he meant. So it's you can say he's using the word wrong, or I could say you're misquoting him. It doesn't matter. But you guys aren't talking about the same thing.
I wouldn't say he's using the word wrong based on what you said. I just don't understand, based on what you said, helps me inform myself about his view better. I wouldn't say he's wrong about self-esteem. Now I would say I just don't understand why he's using that term, self-esteem, if he's talking about only these specific things and not abstracting about yourself. Then I think he has some great ideas. So I think that's a problem. Now, another problem with some of Nathaniel Brandon's writing, and he seems to have somewhat different views at different times in his books, he says self-esteem springs from these things, being efficacious and being responsible, being assertive. Self-esteem springs from that, and that's a behavioral model, an AC model. So at A, the activating event, you're efficacious or you act responsibly or assertively, and then at C, self-esteem sprung up. But that's not how our emotions work. The way our emotions work is it's never A that causes C. It's never our actions, internal or external, or how we feel at A that forces us to feel anything about ourselves at C, good or bad, but it's always our thinking about it. So there's no springing out of the blue, but there's always our thinking, and that's what I'm focusing on, the fundamental principle behind self-esteem, your thinking. And as I'm defining it, self-esteem means globally evaluating yourself, abstracting about yourself, and I understand what you're saying, Rosalind. He doesn't really mean it that way, so maybe you've put your finger on the difference. Do we have any more time out, Jayant?
Well, we have another 5 minutes if there's any more questions.
Any further questions? Everyone has given up self-esteem?
Well, still catch you during the coffee time.
Yeah.
And we'll break for 20 minutes for coffee.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.